So good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on your time zone or how tired you are. My name's Morna Ballantyne, and I'm the Executive Director of Childcare Now, the Childcare Advocacy Association of Canada. Welcome to our progress report on the building of the Canada-wide system of early learning in childcare. I'd like to begin with our land acknowledgement. So today, this webinar is hosted from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. We know that many of you are joining from other parts of Canada, and we encourage you to consider the land in which you inhabit. We acknowledge the historical oppression of lands, cultures, and the original peoples in what we now know as Canada. We commit to advocating for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, its 94 calls to action, including the call on governments to develop culturally appropriate early childhood education programs for Indigenous families and communities. So I invite you all, if you wish, to put your own land acknowledgements in the chat, and as we suggest, to reflect for a moment on the land in which you inhabit. And I know we collectively express our gratitude for being here. I want to introduce my co-hosts for the evening. Martha Friendly, who's the Executive Director of the Childcare Resource and Research Unit, and Dawn Gisbrecht, who's the CEO of the Canadian Childcare Federation. So our three organizations have been working, collaborating very closely for many years, and we're delighted to sponsor this webinar together this evening. It's going to be a relatively informal session, and by that I mean we're bound to make all kinds of errors along the way. We're all, I think, like you, zoomed out, as they say, and it also, for some of us, has been a long day, a long week, long month, and a long year. We're going to start with, I'm going to start with a short presentation, and then we're going to follow that with essentially a conversation between Dawn, Martha, and myself. And we will then be hopefully getting to questions that you may have. Please, throughout the session, share your own comments, your own observations, your own questions, so that we can make this as participatory as we can in the short time that we have. We are recording the session so that we can post it on the Childcare Now and the Canadian Childcare Federation's YouTube accounts. So if you know people who wanted to be here and but couldn't, you can refer them to those YouTube accounts to get to hear the session. We're also broadcasting live on Facebook. So thanks everybody who's joining us live through Facebook, or who's joined the Zoom webinar, or who will be watching it later on watching the recording later on. I want to apologize in advance to a few of you, because this is my third webinar today where I'm presenting the same material. So some of you will have heard this before, and I really apologize. Those of you who have, go take a break or something, a glass of water, do whatever you need to do, or bear with me. So I just want to say and start by saying that it's incredibly hard to believe that it wasn't even a year ago that Canada's first woman finance minister introduced her first budget 2021, and announced the Liberal government's intention to build a Canada-wide system of early learning and childcare. Minister Freeland said that the plan would drive economic growth and pandemic recovery, that would finally put in place a secure bridge for women to get into the paid labor force, and it would give every child access to high quality early childhood education and care. She said that this building of this system would be, and I quote her words from her budget speech, a transformative project on scale with the work of previous generations who built a public school system and public health care. So this budget, in the budget, what the federal government said is that it would use its considerable spending power to forge a partnership with provincial and territorial governments to build a primarily not-for-profit system. Specifically, it would spend an additional $30 billion over the next 5 years for early learning and childcare. And that annual federal spending after 25-26, that's at the end of the 5 years, would continue and be set at a minimum annual expenditure of $9.2 billion, stressing minimum. About $2.5 billion of the $30 billion would be earmarked for the implementation of the Indigenous Early Learning and Childcare Framework. Some of the new funding would be used to put in place a new federal secretariat on early learning and childcare, and support a new advisory council on early learning and childcare. The federal secretariat is now up and running, and we hope that appointments to the new federal advisory council on ELCC will be made shortly. The bulk of the funds, the bulk of this new $30 billion would be transferred to provinces and territories that agreed to be part of a new Canada-wide system of early learning and childcare. And then the federal budget set some parameters for this system and for the federal transfers. It said that the federal funds would be used to reduce parent fees. It would increase the number of quality, affordable spaces. It would address workforce problems, including the problem of recruitment and retention. And it would put in place more before and after school childcare. The federal government also said that the federal government would take steps to collect data, to measure progress, and to put in place accountability measures, including public reporting. Immediately after this budget was adopted, the federal government reached out to the provinces and territories, and things happened very quickly. The first agreement, Canada-wide agreement, was reached with British Columbia on July 8th. And the other agreements were announced in very quick succession. There was also an election in there. But as of today, agreements are in place with every government except Ontario. We are hoping that Ontario will sign an agreement before the end of this month, and that means before the end of next week. Dawn, Martha, you'll remember that after the federal budget was released, we had a webinar just like this.
Just like this. And
I think
Indeed.
Hundreds, right? Hundreds, maybe up to close to 1,000 people joined the webinar. And I think we were everybody just incredibly excited by the federal announcement. You know, we had been campaigning, so many of us, so many of us and others for decades for a Canada-wide childcare system to be put in place. And we finally saw that this actually might happen. And I don't think any of us expected there to be as much as $30 billion being put to this project in the first 5 years. At the time of that webinar, remember, we shared what we thought would be key elements of childcare transformation, the way we see childcare transformation. That is, we identified some of the key elements, policy elements that would be required in each jurisdiction across Canada if we were really going to replace the patchwork delivery of childcare services, which we refer to as the childcare market. If we were to replace the childcare market with a robust, comprehensive, high quality, affordable, inclusive, accessible system. So I want to share quickly with you a slide that summarizes what those elements are that we identified at the time. And these are elements that the childcare movement has identified for many years as being what's required to actually move childcare from the market into a public system. So what we've always said is to get rid of the very precarious childcare market, that governments would have to embrace fully a vision of publicly funded and publicly managed childcare, that would be fundamental. We also said that governments would have to work to improve access, affordability, and quality simultaneously. We've often referred to these as the 3 legs of the stool, and that you can't make one much longer at the expense of another, or it won't be stable. And so what you really have to do is move forward. What governments have to do and advocates have to push for is that progress be made in each of those three areas. We have said that the provision of quality and inclusive childcare services should no longer be dependent in any way on parent fees, that governments should fund fully and sufficiently operations, and that it would have to be sufficient to be able to, the funding would have to be sufficiently high levels to provide high quality care at low or no cost to parents. We also have said consistently that to build the system right, it is crucial that there be ongoing active public, parent, and stakeholder engagement, that governments can't do this alone and should not be left to do this on their own. And we also said, of course, that quality, to be able to enhance quality and to be able to expand, to increase the number of affordable spaces, we need, and this is desperately the case, I would suggest now, we need workforce strategies. And of course, we also said that system building should be based on evidence-based policies, and that the building of the system has to be very carefully monitored through data collection. There also has to be research done, and the whole system has to be made accountable and transparent. So that is the background. And now we're going to get into a discussion about what's been accomplished in the last year. How has our vision and have our elements, our identified elements, been realized? Have governments acted in those areas that we said they need to act on? And I'm going to start just by asking some questions of Martha and John. So Martha, I wanted to start with you and take the leg of the stool, the affordability leg of the stool. And I want you to maybe provide in a very summary way, because we don't have time to go from coast to coast to coast looking at every agreement, but in a general way, what are the different approaches that the provinces and territories have been taking to lowering parent fees and making regulated childcare more affordable through the negotiation of these agreements? How are they using the federal funds to address affordability?
Yeah, great question, Morna. And let me just start by saying that starting from the principle of affordability, this was stated in the federal budget as fee reduction with specific targets. And just keep in mind that they're not really the same thing, because you can have fee reduction but not affordability. But I think there was a recognition that we were aiming at affordability because there are two fee reduction targets. First, reducing parent fees to 50% of this year, and then in the next couple of years, reducing them to an average of $10 a day. So there's at least a recognition of that and something to work on. Well, at first, it seemed very clear what that actually meant. What was a 50% reduction? However, and I think this is really what the point of this is, that based on what we know so far, the provinces and territories have different interpretations of what fee reduction means. And what we also know is that these different policy and funding routes aimed at fee reduction will have different effects on actual parent fees. So we've been looking at the available action plans, and you can categorize of the publicly available action plans that have enough detail so far. So we're just looking at 8 of them at this point. You can see that they're using 3 different categories of what can be described as fee reduction. So the first category is, and this is provinces that already have set provincial fees. This would be provinces where they already have a set fee, and this does not include Quebec. It's PEI and Newfoundland. So what they're actually doing is reducing the provincial set fee by 50%, which is pretty straightforward. You know what the provincial set fee is, and you can cut it in half and say that's what we should be aiming at next year. So that's one category. Another category of fee reduction is, this is a little bit harder to explain. The province or territory pays a flat rate per space to childcare programs, and it's earmarked to fee reduction. Now, this is not quite so straightforward, and there's a number of pitfalls with this, but it's actually a pretty common. I think there are 5 provinces and territories that are doing this, and you can see that it still depends on what the market fee was before, so they can be all over the map. It can mean, and if we're looking at an average of 50%, it can mean that in some centers the fees can be quite high, and in other centers the fees can be quite low. So this is actually, it is reducing fees, but it's not doing it in a very transparent and a very, it'll be interesting to see how it comes out, but it's a different way of approaching fee reduction. And so that's the second way. And then the third thing that 3 of the provinces and territories so far are doing is they're tinkering with the fee subsidy system and counting that into fee reduction. Now, one of the things I want to remind people of is that fee subsidies are not fee reduction. They reduce the out-of-pocket costs for parents who are eligible or who get it. There's some, quite a bit of variety, but it's actually the government paying the parent fee on behalf of the parent. It's not actually reducing fees. So the term, the term began to be used out-of-pocket costs rather than fee reduction. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that they're not the same thing. So, right now we're sort of trying to, look at how are these going to work. And I think that by next year, we'll sort of see better how they work. But it is quite true that what was set out was that there would be a fee reduction of an average of 50% of parent fees. And I think that that's happening, but it's happening in a variety of ways. And I think what we'll see at the end of next year, it's going to be really important to monitor and assess these to see what's achieving the desired results. We don't know this yet. All we can see is what some of the provinces and territories are doing, which is, and I'm not suggesting that they all have to be the same thing, but it goes back to this idea of evidence-based and which things, will work, we'll see. But I mean, I think that's my only, my summary of what we see happening on the affordability front, interpreted as fee reduction. So yes, I'll leave that for now, and maybe there'll be some questions about it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that for sure it's had a good effect that parents have in most cases seen fees go down, or what they're paying going down.
What they're paying,
out of pocket,
yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Whether or not, as you say, whether or not it's affordable, that's a separate, not necessarily. And some have done better through the fee reductions than others, especially
Yes.
relative to household income. And I guess the other thing is, and I'm gonna get you later to talk about this, especially in the context of workforce, of what's happened, is that for the most part, parent fee revenue has been replaced with public funding, but it hasn't necessarily gone up. So we can't, if we start with this idea that parent fee revenue was never sufficient to be able to pay for a really high quality program and an inclusive program with proper compensation, and nor was operational funding. In some respects, we're not yet better off, but on the whole, the other thing I would say is that probably a lot of parents think that their fees were going to be cut by half by the end of 2022. And that's for sure not necessarily the case. So there might be a problem around managing expectations, or some parents feeling, wait a minute, what's happening here? I thought my fees were getting cut by 50%, and that's not necessarily happening.
It isn't, and certainly people are happy. I mean, if you're paying less money for childcare, probably people aren't questioning how it's happening. It's when you think about it, how it builds a system, a transformed, not market system down the road, is when you have to start thinking about what effects these things are going to have, and we haven't seen them yet. So okay. We're looking at them. I think everybody really needs to be paying attention to this.
So let's just turn to another leg of the stool before going to Dawn to briefly tell us what about the expansion of the system? there were some, the federal government said they're going to put more in place. They also, by the way, said there were going to be more school age spaces, but these agreements only cover programs for children under the age of 6, except in the case of Manitoba, where it's under the age of 7. But school age childcare for older children is really not being addressed, at least through this round of agreements. But what about expansion? What's happening there? Are they each agreed to some targets? Are they likely to be met? What steps are they taking?
So I guess this is to me more now to sort of get
yes,
this.
sorry, Martha, this is to you. Yes.
Yeah, I sort of thought
See,
it was.
that's what I mean. We haven't rehearsed properly. Yeah, Martha, that's your question.
We've been doing a lot of work on this. And so if you think about it, except the availability of spaces or supply was expressed as accessibility. And to make it a reality, as we said, we really need a major, but also planned expansion of quality childcare. And this is especially true as parent fees go down and the demand increases, because that's definitely going to happen if parent fees go down. And this has happened everywhere, including in Quebec, that the demand will increase. Now, I just to make a couple of points about expansion, and this is kind of precedes this, is to ensure, so we've made a commitment that expansion should primarily be in the public or nonprofit sector. And what that really means from our point of view is that it shouldn't be crowded out by the well-funded childcare investors that are looking for opportunities. And you can certainly see, because they have set targets, and if there isn't real growth to meet the targets that they've all set, you can see that there's going to be some pressure in to do this. But what we've been saying, and to tell you the truth, at the Childcare Resource and Research Unit, we've done a whole lot of work on this question of expansion, which you'll find on our website, because it's our view that you need to make the shift from thinking that the expansion of childcare is a private responsibility. This is kind of the key to this, to making it a public government responsibility. And this means that there needs to be a plan and a strategy to increase in an even and equitable way the supply of childcare services. Because if it's left now, it will continue as it is. And so the way it really is, childcare expansion now occurs, is that essentially it waits for somebody to turn up to open up childcare, and if it meets the regulations in general, there will be a childcare center there, or a family childcare, rather than looking at it to say, well, where do we need childcare? Where are the childcare deserts? What are we lacking here? There's no infant care here. What is it that we need? Which is a much more tried and true. And if you look at other countries, or places in Canada where there has been planning and proactive expansion, it really works. If we're going to do it in a big way, I think that really what needs to happen is that each province and territory needs to develop its own expansion plan. And this is one thing that really would have to be done by each province and territory with the collaboration of people in the community, because there is quite a lot of variation in how childcare has expanded. I mean, to give you an example, in Ontario, a good deal of the childcare is located in schools. And one of the reasons for that is because it was actually government policy at one point, and this is also true in some of the other provinces, but it's been a policy in Ontario for a long time that childcare should be in school space that isn't being used and built into new schools. Or Ontario has a municipal role where the municipalities have had more of a role in actually being proactive about deciding where childcare is needed. So you can look at different structures that could be part of expansion plans in addition to planning. And I want to say that there are different kinds of structures that are quite possible to do this. The most interesting one that has come along in the agreements is the quasi-public central agency that Nova Scotia has proposed, which is an interesting, different way to do it than, for example, doing it at the local level through municipalities. So, I mean, the way to think about this is that there are different variations of how childcare can be developed in the public and nonprofit sectors in a proactive way, created in places where it's needed and not in places where it's not needed. But it needs to be done really through public responsibility. And again, I would really have liked to, there isn't any example of this being included in any of the agreements in a comprehensive way, but it's addressed in different places. I mean, I'm giving you the Nova Scotia example, and there's a recognition that there needs to be expansion, but I don't think it's really come together yet. And I would say that this is a place where there could be a lot more collaboration between and amongst the provinces and territories. I would see the federal government kind of taking a role in sort of saying, well, these are some of the ways that this could be done. And when I'd certainly see the role for community members to say, if we want to get the expansion that you're counting on and that we're counting on to actually make these principles a reality, there's got to be a proactive way of doing this in each province and territory. And we'd like to see that sooner than later. I think it's very important. I think it'll be a real problem if we're sort of at the same normal point where there's a little bit of expansion, which there normally is just by, just naturally, kind of organically, but it has to be much more focused than it's ever been. So I think that's, you can read, we've written a lot of stuff about this, and it's on the CRRU website, and please take a look at it. And this is something I think people really need to be advocating for in every part of Canada, is a clear expansion strategy for each province and territory.
Thanks a lot, Martha.
Thank you.
This is probably the piece too that really needs rethinking on the part of governments, because everybody's been so reliant on this pop-up childcare, reliant on individuals or not-for-profit organizations or commercial organizations to provide the childcare. Yeah. And now we have to switch the onus. The onus has to be in government to make it happen. So Don, one of the big things that we've been talking a lot about with respect to expansion, but for a lot of other reasons, is the workforce. These agreements were negotiated during a pandemic, during a time of crisis in the childcare sector. I mean, the childcare sector has always been in crisis, but we saw some huge, hundreds, I don't know how many, thousands, early childhood educators leaving the sector, either temporarily or permanently. And the question that keeps getting raised over and over again, every time we have these discussions about building a system and about expansion, is who is going to staff, who is going to actually make this expanded system work? Like how are the workforce problems going to be addressed? So what have we seen so far with respect to
so it's great. Thanks, Morna. And isn't this for many of you on this call today, or on this webinar tonight, I should say, this is perhaps, and not discounting the three legs of the stool, because we know they're all important, but this is a really important leg, right? This is so important, the workforce. And here we are 2 years later, almost to the day from when the pandemic hit Canada and the globe for that matter. And we knew right away at that moment, Morna, Martha, myself, Chris from Matart, many others, the childcare associations from across Canada, et cetera, all immediately flagged this as such an important issue and such a crippling issue really for so many in this country. And not to rehash this too much, but if we're talking about policy, which we are tonight, you saw right away in 2020 what a difference policy and funding made to the sector. You looked at the three provinces of Quebec, PEI, and Nova Scotia, where those provinces all stepped in and said, this service, this sector is too important for children, for communities, for economies, for women, etc. We are going to fully support it and make sure that nobody in the sector loses a job and are kept whole and programs are kept operational. That was a really really important moment for us in Canada as we looked at not just the service of childcare, but at the workforce of childcare and how those public policy decisions made such a difference then. So we fast forward here to last year and the budget, and I think this is an important point. And Morna's referenced the incredible budget and the principles of it and the policy goals of it earlier in her opening remarks. But I think this is really important to also highlight in that the budget specifically talked about the early learning and childcare workforce. The slides there, you can read it, but the words are incredibly important. But Martha said it earlier, and this is a theme that's going to run throughout. And I'll quote you here, Martha, because I wrote it down. The different interpretation of what these ideas mean. And this is a great example of that. Certainly it applies to affordability and applies to expansion of services, but most definitely it is applying to the workforce. And there's another word that Morna mentioned that we're going to keep, and Martha did just now as well, we're going to keep repeating, and that is the word strategy, because we need strategies around each and every one of these issues, right? We cannot just be leaving these really important legs of the stool to chance. And so most certainly, we have heard from provincial and territorial ministers, Minister Gould herself, Minister Hussain, when he was minister as well, federal minister, how important the workforce is. And I think that's really a credit to all the work that all of you have done through the years. And most certainly I can tell you that between the three of us hosting this call tonight over, from the start of the pandemic till continuing on, we continue to advocate and reinforce how you cannot build quality system. You cannot build quality childcare without a workforce, and more specifically, a workforce strategy. And so when we talk about this, and I'm not going to go through an entire laundry list of this, and the reason we say strategy is because we know that the approaches in Canada, even now through the bilaterals, or sort of through the Canada-wide agreement, are typically band-aids, right? They're one-offs. We know that there are grants that have been perpetually used in our sector, a wage enhancement grant or a one-time grant for this or that, so on and so forth. But what we really need to do is connect all those dots, right? We need these long-standing issues, these of compensation, of benefits, including pensions for the workforce, education of the workforce. And by the way, I really think we have to pivot as a sector to talking about it as education and not just training, right? Training is certainly an important part of it, but really we're talking about building educational paths and frankly, getting all of Canada up to a standard of education, because it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and pushing that forward to perhaps we even look at, many of us have heard about how Norway does it, where you have, very pedagogical focused education, and you actually have master's programs and people with their master's degrees working in childcare programs. Dare to dream, right? That we need to head in that way. We also need career paths that are very clear for the workforce, because as Morna said, the workforce has suffered incredibly through the pandemic, and that is what I hear from coast to coast to coast. We couldn't open up all our spaces today because X number of people are away. I've had an ad out for weeks, for months, and I'm not getting any applications. I hired somebody, but they weren't good enough, so we had to let them go. This is a really, really big issue that absolutely has to be addressed in a very comprehensive way. So we need those provincial and territorial workforce strategies that encompass the elements, as I said, of benefits, of wages, of education, of pensions, of career paths. How do we recruit and retain this workforce, ECEs and providers, and create pathways for them? And so we've seen, again, as Martha said, disparate approaches thus far. And it does concern us that, and me certainly as well, that perhaps these first forays into the workforce and the Canada-wide plan, are they setting a tone for the rest of the agreements, or the future of the agreements, I should say. But I choose to be a lot more optimistic than that. But at the same time, what we have seen are really, again, more band-aid approaches and lots of words, right? As the song says, more than words can say. We need actions, right? We absolutely need actions on this. So if we look at one end of the spectrum, I look into Alberta, where the province of Alberta has certainly approached affordability, as Martha talked about, in a very interesting way by, expanding subsidy levels for families and sort of doing it that way. But what they haven't done then in Alberta, let's keep in mind too, we know that the Alberta childcare workforce, early learning and childcare workforce, was the most impacted through COVID, with the most job losses and the most programs closing, so on and so forth. So there was sadly no announcement to date from the Alberta government that's going to deal specifically with the workforce. And even if it was a one-off, right, specific to the Canada-wide plan, nothing like that there. No commitment at this moment to a provincial wage grid, no commitment to a larger workforce strategy, but certainly, talks about continuing some of their approaches, which are, supporting professional development and some educational opportunities and top-ups to salaries, and even went as far as to say that they are the most generous in the country. But I know many of you in Alberta will push back against that particular, how that was being framed. Then we go to, and I think specifically here actually of Saskatchewan, Manitoba. Saskatchewan last summer announced not exactly a wage floor, but trying to bring some equity to how ECEs are paid in the Saskatchewan sector. Maybe not a horrible first start, and I'm not saying it is, but at the same time, when they did what they did, it supported some, but not all, right? So here we are as a sector, a workforce that has really been challenged and pushed hard through the pandemic, and not everybody was able to benefit from trying to implement those first stages of funding specific to the workforce. And I think of Manitoba, which just a couple weeks ago or a few weeks ago had a press conference where they also talked about specific actions to the workforce and providing, and good time to let everybody know, if you didn't know already, Manitoba, along with Quebec, is one of the only two provinces to have an actual formal pension plan for the sector, which is a good thing. And so they announced some enhancements to that, one-time enhancements to that, along with providing some funding for a savings plan outside of the pension plan, as well as some initial actions specific, again, to trying to create sort of a equity in a bit of a wage for average wages. And certainly then in other provinces, you're seeing other actions. I think PEIs in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador have all announced specific actions to the workforce and enhancing salaries and whatnot. But again, it goes to what Martha said about the different interpretations about the priority and the necessity of supporting the workforce. So one of the things we're certainly looking for then are those provincial or territorial wage force grids. Some of the agreements have talked about them specifically. Others are not talking about them, but it certainly is a good place to start, and certainly then ties into that larger workforce strategy. Another really good example I think is really important to note, and perhaps some of you read the Globe and Mail story from the other week. And New Brunswick as well, moving forward with their plan, and at their announcement back in December, I believe it was, announced that they were going to increase salaries for ECEs to about $23.47 an hour. Not a bad thing, right, on the face of it. And so, but though when you look into what's happening in New Brunswick specifically, there are EAs in the education system that are making $31.09. Right. So while that is perhaps much better for an hourly salary for an ECE than what they were making prior to the announcement, certainly though it is not keeping pace with other similar scope, similar style of jobs. And so it's always in those details, which we know all too well. So it's been a start. It's been a start, but it's not where it needs to be. And most certainly we need to absolutely keep a focus on what is happening specific to the early learning and childcare workforce, because we cannot build a sector without them.
Thanks so much, Don. I want to get to some questions fairly quickly before we get into, a few quick questions I think that could be answered before we go to the next part, which is kind of like, so we've said where there's some good things happening, we've identified some gaps that I really want to get both of you thinking about, well, what are we going to focus on, at least in the next year or two, and trying to make this system building go better. But there's a couple of specific questions. Somebody asked, by the way, what happens with these agreements if there's government change? And I guess that would be true federally as well as provincially. Now we know that there's just been an agreement reached federally between the NDP and the Liberals that will not necessarily guarantee that the Liberals are in office, even though they're in a minority, until 2025, but at least there's a commitment by both those two parties to work together to help make that happen. It seems to me that's probably a good thing for childcare, because every time we can use every time we can get, all the time we can get to actually bolster up the system before risking a change of government federally. But of course, provincially and territorially, there are changes of government all the time. So what's the answer to that? Anybody want to grab what's going to happen to these agreements if there's a government change by province or federal?
Are you looking to us, Morna?
Yeah, I'm looking to you. Yeah. I know the answer, but go ahead, Martha.
Go ahead,
well,
Martha.
The thing is, we've seen agreements wiped out. Before. There's, I think there's usually like a legal year or something like that notice, but they can be wiped out. So, I think this is true. You can see in the last round of the bilaterals, there were several changes of government where a program that was started, for example, in Alberta, the $25 a day centers, the program was ended when the government changed. So these things, in a situation where governments will always change. The thing is, and I do think who was quite adamant on this back more than a decade ago was Ken Dryden, actually, who was the minister who tried to put a much smaller plan in place, but quite important, who always said we have to get things in place so that we're painted into a corner, so that it can't be taken away. That was the experience in Quebec when they started the program, where there were successive elections, but they went ahead quickly enough so that people came to expect the program and to depend on it. So I think you have to think about it as, structurally, government they change government and they can't do whatever they want, but they can do certain kinds of things. But there's a whole other contingent, a whole other piece of it that has to do with what does the public come to expect? Mm-hmm. And I think that you have to keep both those things in mind.
Yeah, Julia in the chat said, and I think this was probably the best answer, that if they tried to take it away, people would riot. And we certainly want to move fast enough, quick enough that governments would know that they would have riots on their hands if they tried to touch it, and instead of trying to make it better. So let's in that vein. So it sounds to me, if I can summarize what you've said, is that it started. We always said that the signing of the agreements were only the start. We never said that a system was going to be built, or that we could declare that we had a system just because we have a lot of federal, provincial, or territorial agreements. That really what they do is provide a mechanism and to build a system. And we know that some of the agreements are stronger than others and more prescriptive than others in terms of what that system would look like. But what do you think we have to pay a lot of attention to over the next year? I'm going to just focus on the next 12 months or so, because we have to remember that the way these agreements are structured is that they contain an action plan that covers up until 23, 24. And then another action plan has to be developed by the provinces, and the federal government has to actually agree to the next action plan. So there is sort of a checkpoint coming up pretty closely. to see sort of where we're at, what I guess what more has to be done, what corrections, recalibrations, or whatever have to be made, and maybe what new initiatives have to be launched. Like in Alberta, as was said in the chat, they're doing nothing on wages. They consider they already have a wage grid. By the way, the Alberta government says it has a wage grid because it has a top up. That's how they define a wage grid. So just very briefly, Dawn, what would be in your top of your list of something to pay really close attention to? And what would you want to see? I would say, talk a little bit about what the federal government's role would be in making sure that the thing on your list is addressed.
Yeah. So can I just start before I answer that last part, Morna?
Yeah.
One of the things we need to see, because we're not seeing it in most jurisdictions, is the full consultation and engagement of the sector in the system building. More so, it's either window dressing or not there at all. And so we really need to see that real fulsome and honest engagement. And so most certainly then the federal government, they are the primary funder, and we need them to certainly respect the boundaries of federalism and the roles of provinces and territories. But at the same time, there is opportunity there to use the phrase, to flex their funding muscles to help push the direction of these agreements in terms of those policy principles, like the workforce, right? Like supply side funding. I really, absolutely believe that they understand these issues and they understand how they are interconnected, but at the same time need to then take that understanding and help move those provinces and territories along via the mechanisms they have at their disposal.
I'm so glad you raised this issue of public engagement. There is a requirement in these agreements to put in place implementation committees, which are made up of federal and provincial representatives. But those committees are supposed to be engaging and consulting, not just with the sector, but broadly, stakeholders broadly defined, and the public. And my sense looking across the country is that the extent to which there is consultation, it tends to be very private, behind closed doors and with select people. A number of jurisdictions have put in place advisory committees, which is a great thing, except that I've heard that members of these advisory committees or reference groups or whatever have to sign non-disclosure agreements and can't actually even discuss what is being discussed in these meetings with their co-workers or the constituencies. And there doesn't seem to have been much effort made in any jurisdiction. Maybe BC is an exception. BC folks can chat about this in the chat, whether or not I'm wrong about that. But in terms of public engagement, to really make it a public project, although the federal government has certainly signaled its commitment to do that and has talked about that. Martha,
Morna, can I just say it's something you've really said a lot for quite some time, and I think it's really important.
My hobby horse, you mean?
Yeah. But it's about a democratic process, right? Yeah. And that's something that we haven't always talked about in Canada, in our sector specifically. But I think that's a really, really important point. Just leave it there.
Yeah. Martha, what would be on your list? Something to pay a lot of attention to.
Well, I mean, thinking that this might be a question, I think there are two main things, and I don't see them happening yet. So people should really be clear. One of them is about the really important thing that we've said over and over again about the three legs of the stool working together in a coordinated fashion. And that's something that really needs to be understood and promoted by the federal government to the provinces, because otherwise we're going to have all of these unintended consequences. And so things won't go well. So I think that's really, really important, that's what system building depends on. It's not just cherry picking one or the other. But I think the other one is one, I'd say we've made some progress on this, but not sufficiently. And that's the matter of how the funding works. And you can see this going back to not only to what I said, but it's how the money is being used to actually, pay for the service, to lower the fees, to pay the staff, and to expand the system. It's really important for people to understand the difference between operational funding and patchy bits of funding. Dawn mentioned grants and things like that, but that this is like the goal of this is to actually have something that is part of the social infrastructure that gets a childcare center, gets a budget to operate its operations, and doesn't have to depend on applying for a grant or waiting for the parent fees to show up. You know, there may be parent fees, but it's not, there's a real difference between real operational funding, fee subsidies, grants, and you know, kind of a patchwork. And I don't think that that's really, the penny has dropped yet. I think it's certainly true with the workforce. The salaries and compensation of the people working in a childcare center is about 85% of the budget in a nonprofit center, depending on the, you know, rent and all that sort of thing, but say 85%, it's most of the budget. It shouldn't be done through an enhanced, raising it shouldn't be through an enhancement grant. It should be built into the budget. So I think people really should think about operational funding and really communicate that there will be no transformation unless the funding itself is transformed. Going forward, I think that's a real role that the federal government needs to play, is basically providing the glue on those kinds of things that are fundamental and overarching for system building. And we'll cover the other, you know, the other things will be part of it.
Okay, that's really helpful. A number of comments in the chat from the BC advocates, the Ontario advocates, the Alberta advocates. They've all identified that they have provincial roadmaps. They've developed these roadmaps that set out very specific policy recommendations in all the areas that you've touched upon, that we've touched upon so far in each province. And it seems to me that using these roadmaps in the coming year is going to be really important, so that, you know, we're all on the same page in each province and across the country about what are these key elements that need to change to actually transform a system from market to public service. So I really want to encourage some of the links to the roadmaps have been given in the chat. Please check out roadmaps in your province. Some of them are less official than others, and they're also all available. Links to all the roadmaps that exist are available on the Childcare Now website, which is time for, what is it again, Erica? Time for childcare. Time for childcare.
I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you. Put it in the chat. And also, ours, for the most part, links to CRRU's website. So, Martha, you've been keeping close tabs, and any kind of like media coverage, roadmaps, tools for advocacy, and so forth. They're all in one place, which is incredibly useful.
And we're going to keep that up, and we're just about to expand that. So, trying to pull all this stuff together so that people will kind of be able to go to it. I mean, we're sort of librarians at heart. And I think it's really important for people to keep up on these things and to be communicating with each other about them. There are a lot of tools around now, like this is not 50 years ago. We know there's a lot more that people know and think about this now. So
I also want to raise an issue that has come up in this first year, further to the negotiation of collective agreements. A big issue in Nova Scotia, a big issue in Alberta, particularly around the question of where does for-profit childcare fit in a Canada-wide system of early learning and childcare. And I suggest that there's probably a lot of misinformation around this question with respect to, you know, some are saying, some of the for-profit or commercial providers have publicly said that the Canada-wide agreements are going to result in shutting down commercial operators, and with, you know, taking away regulated childcare out of the reach of parents because they're going to shut down and so forth. Martha, can you just comment on that question about where does that fit?
Where it stands is the commitment was made, and this has been an issue from the beginning, the issue of for-profit childcare, where the community, where we landed and where I think the government landed was that what is existing will be continue to be funded, would come into the new funding arrangements, would be funded as the others are, with new kinds of restrictions, which should be wage grids. And from our perspective, that there should be established set fees. and that there would be some boundaries around how the money can be used, and that there should not be expansion in the for-profit sector. The way it was framed in the budget, and it was primarily in the public and not-for-profit sector. And so there's some wiggle room around the edges in some of the agreements. That's something that is going to be a continuing issue. Again, it has to do with expansion, but it is definitely not true that the for-profit sector has been shut out. It may be that people don't like having new kinds of restrictions, boundaries placed on how the money can be spent, which basically should be a requirement. It's public money, actually. We're talking about public money here, but it's just, if that's clear, that they are not shut out from being funded.
I would say one of the things on my list that we're going to really have to pay attention to, and it's related to the discussion of expansion and the need for expansion strategies. But I think there are a couple of things we also need. One is that I think we're going to really have to organize and advocate for public capital funds to actually, because a lot of that so far the federal funding is going to be used essentially for operation, and also to lower the fees, of course, and address low compensation and so forth, the new spaces that are created. But to be able to get new facilities in place requires a plan, and it also requires capital funding. And it's something that government is going to have to do, and we're going to have to figure out ways governments and, with support of the sector, with advice from the sector, are going to have to answer the question about how we're going to get new facilities. And, we've talked about expansion should be in the public sector, in public facilities. Well, that means, that a plan has to be put into place and how you do that. Like, how do you actually figure out what public facilities there are? The other is that there has to be, in my view, much better integration with respect to planning between early learning, childcare, and other public service provision, including public education. And, there has to be coordination between expanding early learning and childcare and the school system. And, that is going to look differently in different jurisdictions. I understand that. But we've always said that we want, early learning and childcare includes kindergarten. And there's going to have to be some connection between kindergarten programs, early learning and childcare programs to help with transition, and also before and after school care. So, and this is true for under 6, and it's true for the kids who are over 6 right up to age 12. This is a big gap that has been identified. The federal budget says that the $30 billion is also for before and after school care, but we are not seeing that yet. So this, I think, is going to be something that we're really going to have to push for over the next year or two. Is there going to be another agreement, or the agreements in 23, 24 back to 25 be amended to include before and after school care? That's something we have to put our minds to. So there are a couple of other questions. I'm sorry, I'm just looking through. Erica, do you see any that are up that we need to address in the time that we have left?
I'm just looking through them now as well. I think there were some questions about defining what public funding actually means. So what we mean when we're talking about public funding versus capital funding.
Oh, good. We need public funding means that it comes from taxes, the government has it. Capital funding is a particular part of public funding. So we need public funding in childcare to pay for the operation of the services. But if we're going to have new services, we need public capital funding to pay for new buildings or fixing old buildings or readying buildings. We need a capital strategy if childcare is going to expand, but they can all be public funding. Does that answer the question? Whomever asked the question?
And it could be that some of this confusion is about something that Sharon Gregson raises in the chat, is that there is so much money that's coming from different sources. to providers or operators, and it gets confusing about, and that what she's suggesting in the track is that we really have to move away from multiple streams of funding and grants to a funding formula, operational funding. So that's
right.
another thing that's really high on my list, is that we have to get governments, the provincial, territorial governments, to rethink their operational funding and propose, really solid operational funding formulas, so that we can do exactly what we've said is necessary, and that's ensure that there is sufficient funding to really provide quality programs and quality wages, quality compensation system, programs that are inclusive and so forth. All of that should be funded from government revenues, and it should be revenues that are transferred through expenditures, and should be allocated in a provincial budget or territorial budget, and should be transferred directly for the operation of services, and not indirectly through parent fee subsidies or indirectly to staff through wage enhancement grants or top-ups. It all should be, you just don't see this in any other sector, it seems to me.
I think
Don,
that's
do you want to add to
really,
that?
yeah, I just to put an exclamation point on that, Morna, and we've talked about this, that the sector itself has to really rethink how how operations are funded, right? And moving away, as we've all said here, moving away from those one-off, well, you've got this money, that money, so on and so forth, and really think about how that core operational funding will make the impact into your program. That is really something that we all have to be switching our own thinking to as well as we move forward here. And as you've said, this is going to, nobody said it's going to happen overnight. And I know many people are looking for that one magical answer, but it's going to take time to get there, as you both have said. And I think that's also really important to remember.
Yeah.
Can I just add here that one of the
Martha.
things about this is that the lack of sort of the confusion around funding, which level of government it comes from when it flows to the federal government, to the province, and sometimes through to a municipality, or people who are service providers have to go around figuring out which funds they should apply for and things, is a complete waste of time. And it sort of keeps everybody kind of capacity challenged, essentially. Childcare should just be funded, as we said, through a formula that allows for different circumstances, like if you have to build fix your playground or something like that. But it's perfectly possible to do that. Quebec has done that to some fairly large extent. I wouldn't say that it's perfect, but that was the big change that Quebec made, was funding the services through a formula. So they don't have the same bits and pieces. Actually, there are some bits and pieces, but it's not to the extent that there is elsewhere. I think there's some room to go. I think that's really important, that people shouldn't spend all their time or their capacity on this type of thing.
Yeah. And Jean Bacon in the chat says, is there a reason that it can't be structured in the same way as funding for public education?
Yeah.
K to 12. No, there's no reason it can't. There's absolutely the reason it's not is because it's been cheaper for governments not to do it that way, and because they've depended on the market. Governments have not taken responsibility to actually provide the service. And then they can abdicate all responsibility when it comes to making sure that it is equitable, that they abdicate responsibility for the fact that they're childcare deserts. They can say, well, nobody offered to put up a childcare center or bring children into their homes. So what can we do about it? This has been quite deliberate. And no doubt part of it is because it's a sector that is a feminized sector. It is largely women who have been doing this work. It's a lot of women are dependent on the service, and women have often just been expected to manage, to just figure it out for ourselves. And that's not what a feminist government certainly should believe is the way forward. And it's certainly not a way to actually address and put in place an essential service. And we've all heard through the pandemic about how essential early learning and childcare is. So now it's time to take responsibility and make it a public service in every way, just like the public education system.
Yeah.
Any last remarks? We're coming towards the end of our time. I actually would like to invite anybody on the call to, or in the chat, say what would be at the top of your list of things. I have one more thing. My list is actually really long, and I keep saying this is at the top. So I guess it's a list with many, many tops. But that's that we have to get even better organized. We're going to have to get better organized to put the pressure on. Governments cannot think that we think that they've checked the box, that we have a Canada-wide system of early learning and childcare because agreements have been signed. Right. And it really is up to us to get organized, to communicate. In webinars like this, it's been suggested that what would be really useful is for there to be provincial webinars so that people could really understand what's going on in their province. A number of those webinars have been already organized, but it seems that we can never have too many webinars. So more webinars organized on a provincial basis, that's being asked. So we will work with all of our provincial partners to help make that happen. Are there other ideas? I'm looking at the chat.
Yeah.
Everyone on this Zoom needs a provincial association. And we have advocacy associations now in most provinces or networks. And we have, Dawn, we have associations
in every province. And I think I saw a few folks from Northwest Territories who have just formed a brand new association in that territory. So congrats to them just a couple weeks ago. So Morna, Jeff was just reminding us to say again where we're going to make this recording available. So I didn't want to lose sight of that. So certainly we'll put it on the Federation YouTube, and then
we'll put it on our website. Yeah, we'll put it on our website.
We'll all have it on our website somewhere.
Yeah, and I think Erica's going to put all those links in the chat as we get for the different YouTube channels and so forth. And Google, great.
Can I say one last thing? I think the childcare movement is in better shape than it has been since the 1980s, actually. I was thinking about this today, and we were in very good shape. Somebody sent me something, I think it was Jamie Cass, if you're here, Jamie, something from the National Action Committee on the Status of Women Childcare Committee. And we were in very good shape then, but I think we're in better shape now. We have much, much more from government to work with than we ever had. And for that reason, it's our opportunity. We have 15 minutes of fame, and we better run with this and really, really put ourselves into making this, entrenching it enough so that it can't be taken away. That we're really solid if something happens. So I think we're in very good shape. I don't want to complain about it because what has been put forward is huge. It's just not finished. It's not a done deal. And that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's you know what, the door has been open to build a comprehensive system of early learning and childcare. But it's very early days. So I was looking up Sweden, and I think it was 30 years that it took before and Norway, I think maybe not quite as long, but pretty long. This does not, and the other thing is you never reach a point where you say, okay, this is it.
It's done.
It just always has to be changed and improved. This is, I think, one of the reasons why the provincial governments are so freaked out about this, is because they recognize that actually they are embarking down a path that is going to require continuous improvement and more funding. And so it should. Canada is a hugely wealthy country. All we have to do is rearrange some spending priorities, and that's not a problem. And anyway, this is a sector that contributes enormously to the economy in all kinds of ways. It's been so well documented. So we're in, this is not 15 minutes of fame, Martha. This is, I think, at least 15 years.
15 years of fame.
15 years of fame. That's right.
15 years of hard work.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Great. So lots of lots of comments. Gita, thanks. An astounding session. Yeah, I think we should all feel incredibly good for having achieved so much so quickly. I think the governments have to be congratulated for going as far as they have. And we will keep making sure that they keep going further and further and further. And so we cheer them on, but we also have to make sure that this is done right. So lots more work to do. Make sure you do stay in touch. There are links to connect on social media, to sign up for newsletters. They're all being entered into the chat. And we will be having more of these sessions. And I think it's a good idea. Let's do it. We wanted to give sort of a brief session of overview, a picture, because we're coming up to March 31st, the end of the first fiscal year of the 5-year plan. But there will be lots more in each jurisdiction. So we need to do this work in each jurisdiction. I completely agree with Susan Prentice. One of the things we have to advocate is for some more public resources for our advocacy. If they're building a new huge program and it's a public program and it belongs to us, then they should also recognize the advocates and the sector. We're part of the infrastructure too, and we deserve financial and other support.
Yep, absolutely.
That's for sure.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you
so
to
much.
Erica behind the scenes for running the slides and everything.
Thanks to the whole team
And
behind the
Sophia
scenes.
and everybody else.
Behind the scenes, you guys. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks,
Awesome.
everybody, for
Bye,
joining
everybody.
us.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.